We had an interesting development in the RFK campaign as he seems to have flip-flopped both on his anti-war stances and pro-free speech positions, posture. I don't know, because it sounded to me like at the beginning of the campaign, even though he didn't put all that much meat on the bone, I mean, he was, anti-Ukraine war, but he was always pro-Israel, which means, I don't know, I never really bought him as an anti-war candidate, but at the beginning of the campaign, he at least pitched himself. That's what I was saying. It's a pitch. He pitched himself as being anti-war and pro-free speech. And now he seems to have flipped on both of those. Now he seems to be pro-war and anti-free speech. And so we saw this tweet come out yesterday. This is from Bill Ackman. Please see my below letter to the president of Harvard University sent today, which was dated November 4th, 2023. Robert F. Kennedy retweets this letter. We're going to find out what's in the letter in just a moment. But he says, bravo, Bill Ackman. It's time to hold college administrations responsible for the epidemic, of campus anti-Semitism by insisting on zero tolerance policies. So you can already tell what this letter is going to be. We're going to get into this in just a moment. Russell's going to read some excerpts of it that he wants to respond to. Before that, though, we should just full disclosure cite this. Investor Bill Ackman, David Sachs' PAC donated to RFK Jr.'s presidential campaign. So this could have something to do with why Bill Ackman's getting that rim job from RFK here. But here is the letter, or pieces of the letter. This letter was 1,000 miles long, extremely long letter. But Russell's going to read some of the pieces of this letter that RFK endorsed. Do you want to just set it up briefly before you start reading pieces, however you want to handle it?
Marilyn was leaving my father's bedroom. I was 5 years old. I had never seen a woman naked before. we like to have fun with friend of show RFK.
Friend of show, Robert.
Friend of show. So I really wanted to take apart this letter because it is so illustrative of so many of the currents of this debate. For one thing, you're seeing the way that people like Ackman are going to use his money to try to crush these conversations and to try to crush speech, and how desperate they are. You also see how all the contradictions in the kind of identity politics that 10 minutes ago someone like Ackman had no trouble with. I never heard him say anything about this. I'm pretty aware of the people who have been speaking out on those campus issues and freedom of speech issues on campus. I've never heard Ackman say a word about it. His arguments are so contradictory and so all over the place. The ultimate effect of it is to attack wokeness for being suppressive of speech and being contradictory, and then to argue for the suppression of speech. It seems like he wants a wokeness that's more inclusive of Jews, I guess, and that suppresses speech that he doesn't like in particular. And platform speech that he does, it's, he just wants to work the refs. And he closes out with quite
that's a great way to put it, yes.
Yeah, and he closes it out with quite a potent economic threat coming from somebody in his position.
Indeed. All right, so let's get into this right now.
When you explained in your October 12th video address, he's speaking, this letter was written to the president of Harvard. When you explained in your October 12th video address that Harvard embraces a commitment to free expression, you sent a clear message that the eliminationist and anti-Semitic statements of the protesters are permissible on campus. Now, this is the trick he keeps pulling. In order to get around his free speech arguments, he calls the arguments of pro-Palestine inherently eliminationist. So that keeps coming up in this. Putting aside the legal limitations on free speech that include restrictions on fighting words and true threats, quote, where speakers direct a threat to a person or group of persons with the intent of placing the victim in fear of bodily harm or death, which honestly, even if you did view that in the abstract as eliminationist from the river to the sea, it would not fit that definition, which I'm sure Ackman very well understands. If Harvard indeed had a strong track record of protecting free speech, many would have taken your support for free speech more seriously. Just 2 weeks prior to October 7th, Fire announced that Harvard achieved its lowest free speech ranking ever for the 2023 academic year, ranking last out of 254 universities with a rating of 0.0. That's like Delta House ranking and
bad score.
House.
It's a bad
loser. Score. The only university with an abysmal speech climate. All right, so don't kill me. But I actually would like to just show a little bit of that. Okay, so Harvard University, so Michigan Technological University is the top-ranked school for free speech. But Harvard obtained the lowest score and is the only school with an abysmal speech climate rating. The University of Pennsylvania, no surprise there. The University of South Carolina, Georgetown University, and Fordham University, right here in New York City, also ranked in the bottom 5. The key factors differentiating high-performing schools from poorly performing ones are scores on the components of tolerance difference and disruptive conduct. Students from schools in the bottom 5 were more biased towards allowing controversial liberal speakers on campus over conservative ones, and were more accepting of students using disruptive and violent forms of protest to stop a campus speech. Deplatforming attempts that occurred at schools ranked in the bottom 5 had an alarming 81% success rate. So I think that is important to note. And that does come up in the article that I'm working on, that not only this is where he has a point. I just think he's making the point very dishonestly and to his own ends and purposes. Yeah, sure. Places like Harvard do not support free speech. They are too free to support shutting down speakers. And sure, they have opened the door to a guy like this to call them hypocrites for all of a sudden being champions of speech. But this is where the entire identity politics are collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, because they don't know what the fuck to do here. They don't know what to do here. You got the Jews claiming a protected minority status. You've got these brown people being killed by the thousands daily. They have no idea how to respond to this. That's really what's going on here. The ideas that they have promoted, and particularly what's very interesting there, is violence. These universities have encouraged these students to protest violently by never reprimanding them for it. When they locked Riley Gaines in a room for 3 hours, screaming threats on camera with their faces. We know who threatened her. Not even a suspension came out of that, right? Brett Weinstein was attacked at Evergreen. People threatening him with baseball bats. Where were the consequences? No consequences. So don't be surprised now when these students protest. And you've got students on the other side, as happened at Cooper Union here in New York, locked in a library with people banging on the doors. Well, you've been encouraging that behavior for years. And then all of a sudden now you're surprised that this is happening around this issue. So just to be clear, while obviously we're very much on the Palestinian side, we're not in favor of violence and violent protest, but I personally feel they made the monster. They built that monster. You shouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is what you taught them to do. What did you think they would do when a genocide? So to continue, Harvard's Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging is an important contributing factor to the problem. According to Harvard's DEI statement, we actively seek and welcome people of color, women, persons with disabilities, people who identify as LGBTQIA, and those who are at the intersections of these identities from across the spectrum of disciplines and methods to join us. In other words, that was a quote. In other words, Jews and others who are not on the above list are not welcome to join. When anti-Semitism is widely prevalent on campus, he's going to contradict this later, by the way, and the DEI office, which quote, views diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as the pathway to achieving inclusive excellence and fostering a campus culture where everyone can thrive, unquote, does not welcome Jewish students, we have a serious problem. Okay, so...
But first of all, it didn't say that they weren't welcome. It said from across the spectrum of disciplines and methods. I mean, that could include anybody, right?
It can. It can. Is he identifying a tendency within these kinds of clubs and within these kinds of movements to want to be exclusionary to the extent of arguing that, you know, they need their own spaces away from whiteness and white people? Because in a part I was trying, for brevity, I cut another part where he lumps in white people too. He says, well, what about white people? Okay, so you do. I mean, legitimately, you do have a lot of people who think in this direction, want basically segregation.
Right, but that's what I mean. But that's what I say. This is working the refs. It's working the refs, and this is what RFK. And just to be clear, RFK did not write this letter. He's endorsing this letter by Bill Ackman.
Right.
You know, RFK will defend Israel, and then when, you know, for example, Jimmy in his interview when he said, well, it isn't Israel an apartheid state, and RFK says, well, you know, if you want to call Israel an apartheid state, that's okay, but you have to call other states in the region for what they are, right? That's just working the refs. He's not actually defending what he believes. He's just saying, well, if you're going to criticize me for what I think, then you have to criticize everybody for what they think. That's a similar sort of logic that Ackman is trying to employ here, which is, well, you guys are censorious and exclusionary with most speech on campus, so now we are going to, as an antidote to that, not be uncensorious. No, we're going to demand that you censor the way we want to, because you're already censoring, right? So this is hardly a free speech letter, quite the opposite. So for RFK to endorse this letter is just it is a complete reversal from all of his rhetoric about taking on censorship in all its forms.
Well, it is very much like Maher's monologue, where it's taking some gripes about campus culture that I would dare say most people have similar gripes, and trying to tie it in a very dishonest way to the cause that he's trying to push. This also, of course, raises the whole question of Jews being the daywalkers of minority groups, right? Are they white? Are they a minority group? Are they a minority group requiring protection? Or are they privileged white people that don't qualify for that kind of status? And I mean, that is there in here. I mean, I've never seen one of these groups that felt they needed to mention Jews as one of the oppressed groups that they're in. Right. And, you know, there was an article in The Root a while ago. This question blew up around Sanders the last time he ran. Is he a white person or is he a minority person?
Right.
And there was an article in The Root kind of addressing this, basically trying to argue what they're arguing with Asians now. Yes, it's a minority group, but it's a privileged minority group, so it's not the same thing. And in the end, yeah, if you ask the people who run this office what they think Jews are, that's probably where they would land. This one's really interesting, and this kind of says it all. How would you respond to a Harvard white supremacist protest where students shouted, "Tulsa, Tulsa, Tulsa," from the Atlantic to the Pacific, "America should be free of black people"? Would Harvard even permit the above demonstrations to take place on campus? This is how warped Bill Ackman, and by extension RFK Jr.'s perspective is. They don't even understand how just absolutely insane that comparison is, and how most people would see the Palestinians as the black people in this scenario.
Right. The metaphor is completely flipped on its head in their mind.
Is Palestine Tulsa? Like, are you comparing Palestine to Tulsa? I mean, this is exactly, you're flipping the whole thing. I mean, it's Tulsa if the Palestinians are victims. If that's what you mean by that, then sure, Palestine is Tulsa. But they're
But in that case, the rallying cry would not be considered, genocidal in nature, right?
Right. It would be supportive of those people.
Right. Exactly. That's the anti-colonial position.
Your remarks imply that anti-Semitism has been a serious issue at Harvard that has gone unaddressed for years. I have been an active alum for 35 years. During this period, I have neither experienced nor have I become aware of any anti-Semitic incidents at Harvard until beginning 4 weeks ago. When I asked my daughter today about her experience with anti-Semitism at Harvard, she graduated in 2020. We won't bring up the alumni connection implications there. She described anti-Semitism when she was at Harvard as, quote, non-existent. While I'm sure it is possible, if not likely, that there have been some anti-Semitic incidents at Harvard over the last 35 years, the reality is that Harvard has been an extremely comfortable place to be Jewish and or Israeli up until the last four weeks. Okay, genius. So what's more likely? That Harvard became rabidly anti-Semitic in the last 4 weeks, or that the country you are supporting is committing a fucking genocide and the students are horrified by it and anti-Semitism doesn't enter into it?
Right. Exactly. I mean, that's about as checkmate a move as you can make right there, right? I mean, nothing could expose better that actually, no, they didn't just become anti-Semitic in the last 4 weeks. Is a response to a political event, to a cataclysmic global event.
Right. Maybe you're on the wrong side.
Right.
So now he gives a list of prescriptions to solve the anti-Semitism epidemic that he just confessed he never saw any evidence of until 4 weeks ago.
Until a war broke out between colonizers and the colonized.
Yes. Yeah. And his daughter, who recently graduated, said absolutely did not exist.
Right.
Okay. So, but this is a problem that clearly needs to be solved, and he lays out how they're going to solve it. So these are snippets of he has a, I think, 7-point plan here. The protesters,
we're not going to get all 7.
No. The protesters who have been chanting intifada and other eliminationist statements should be subject to disciplinary action. So, I mean, that was kind of how we handled the Native Americans, right? When they chanted for liberation and to have their land back.
Right.
That's the kind of eliminationist rhetoric he doesn't want going on anymore. Indians who might have said from the Pacific to the Atlantic, right? Or Native Americans, rather. The university should review the students' Slack message boards to identify those students who have made anti-Semitic statements or shared anti-Semitic imagery. Now, understand, this is coming from somebody who considers the pro-Palestinian position anti-Semitic by definition. So he wants Harvard to go and start disciplining students who might have shared like a Palestinian flag, right? I mean, presumably, if you read the temper of this letter, that would qualify. Certainly to this guy it would. Certainly to Ackman it would. The university should publicly reach out to students in an effort to obtain other examples of anti-Semitic acts that should also be carefully investigated and for which appropriate disciplinary steps should be taken. Because Harvard students are notoriously focused on their job and career prospects post-graduation, disciplinary actions by the administration for failure to meet the university's standards for appropriate conduct that become part of a student's permanent record should serve as an effective deterrent to overt anti-Semitic acts on campus. In other words, shut down their pro-Palestine speech by threatening their careers, which is exactly what they've been doing.
Of course.
You had the truck that was doxing the students who signed the letter. You've had these law firms withdraw offers. The university should form. Okay, this is really funny. Again, in light of everything he's saying, the university should form a task force to review the appropriateness of the activities of the OEDIB, the Diversity Office, and whether its practices of excluding certain minority communities on campus, including Asian and Jewish students, is appropriate, which in fact may be contributing to discrimination against these groups on campus. But you just said you never saw any example of anti-Semitism in 35 years of involvement on the Harvard campus. And
Right.
your recently graduated daughter saw no example of that.
This all manifested in the last 4 weeks.
All in the last 4 weeks, all these actions have to be taken. Harvard's admissions practices should be reassessed to ascertain why the university is admitting racist students, and should consider revisions to the application process to enable the university to better screen the character of candidates for admission. So basically, they want them to go through their social media profiles to eliminate anyone who's critical of Israel.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is not, City College. This is not, whatever, University of Indiana. No disrespect to those fine institutions. But this is Harvard. Like, these are where the elites come from. So what he's saying is we have to go through and vet the biographies and the political opinions of people who seek to use our esteemed university as the vessel through which they enter into the new leadership class of tomorrow, right? So they are literally picking and choosing who will have power down the road. It's especially damning. I mean, look, this would be a sick letter if it were written for any school, but you're talking about elite institutions here. You're talking about future politicians, right? Future leaders, right? Future heads of finance. This is where the powerful people come from.
Well, and when you think through the implications of this, it would essentially eliminate all Muslims, all Arabs, certainly all Palestinians from admission to Harvard. Even Mehdi Hassan speaks out against what's happening in Palestine.
Right.
Even who would get in?
Well, of course. Look, you read a thing like this and you wonder, how is it that 66% of Americans support a ceasefire, but no one in government does? Well, this is how. Because where do the people in Congress come from? Places like Harvard, right? Not all of them, obviously, but disproportionately, right? There's one more slide here.
Harvard should form a task force to understand the constraints on free speech at Harvard that have led it to ranking last on Fire's annual college survey. That is a hoot. So the issues that have led to Harvard's last place ranking can be addressed. Now, that is the one thing he said in this letter that I actually agree with, but it's insane in the context of what he's saying. We need to viciously suppress any opinion that may in any way be pro-Palestine and critical of the Israeli government. And we also have to look into why Harvard has such a poor free speech ranking.
Right.
That's just that's just insane. It doesn't even bear discussing. Title VI of the Civil Rights. Okay, and here comes the threat. Here comes the real threat. The money. He starts fucking with the money. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act requires universities to provide all students, including students who are or are perceived to be Jewish, a school environment free from discrimination. The consequences for a university's failure to meet the requirements of Title VI include the cancellation of federal funding. When coupled with numerous Jewish and non-Jewish alumni that have publicly and privately shared these same concerns, important sources of Harvard's revenues are at risk. In other words, crack down on pro-Palestinian students and protests, both in admission and in current enrollment. Otherwise, we're turning off the money spigot.
Yep, indeed. And just to bring this all back to the beginning, bravo! Bill Ackman, says RFK. Mr. Free Speech, Mr. Civil Liberties candidate. Bravo. Indeed. Wow.
Marilyn's tits were the finest I've ever seen to this day. It ruined me for all future women. Listen, man, I don't take a lot of victory laps, but I'm sorry, man. We were ahead of the curve on this. We called that fucking asshole out very early.
Yeah,
we took a lot of shit for it. We didn't
anticipate the independent run. We thought he was going to fall in line behind.
We did.
Biden.
We were wrong about that.
We were wrong about that. But in essence, I think we called it correctly.
Yes, we did.
Please clap.